Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
You know, like you just stumbled on a whole treasure trove of articles and videos on some topic.
Yeah.
And you get so excited. You're like, everybody needs to know about this.
I know that feel.
You just want to share it with the world, like a big pile of links, you know?
Just a fire hose of information.
Exactly. And then it just sits there, right? This mountain of information. It's almost too much to handle.
Right. It can feel a bit overwhelming. Yeah.
Totally overwhelming. But that's where we come in. Think of us like your guides through this jungle of information, our mission, if you will.
Right. Cutting through the noise.
Exactly. To pull out those really fascinating bits, those aha moments, the stuff that sticks with you without giving you information overload.
That's it. It's like a shortcut to feeling really in the know. You send over some fantastic material, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And today we're going to dive deep into something I think you're really going to love. Aesthetics.
Yes. And forget about just pretty pictures, right? We're gonna get into what actually makes things visually appealing, how we experience art. And get this, even how art connects with something you might not expect. Humor.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing connection. And you've given us such a diverse range of sources to work with. I mean, we've got this YouTube video exploring proportion, contrast, balance, and visual art with examples from MoMA and everything.
Oh, wow.
We've got an academic paper that just takes aesthetics beyond art, talks about music and everyday life, even Japanese traditions. It even mentions Chopin's Funeral March, which is,
Wow.
a very powerful piece of music.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then there's this philosophical deep dive into what even is art, like what's its purpose.
Yeah.
It even touches on questions of morality, copyright, believe it or not, with the monkey selfie making an appearance. Yes.
Oh, I remember that.
And then it gets into the really, really purging those emotions through art. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And then there's this other thing on art theory itself.
Oh, yes. That one goes from formalism all the way to postmodernism, gives us all these different lenses, these ways to understand what we're seeing and experiencing when we look at art.
So many different ways to look at it.
Exactly. And then one of the most interesting ones, an academic paper exploring the connection between humor and aesthetic experience.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah.
It's not something you think about right away.
No, you don't, but it's fascinating.
But they go together.
Right.
Right. And we've got practical stuff too,
Oh, yeah.
a video on harmony, unity, contrast, and painting, Kant's perspective on what makes something aesthetically pleasing.
Yes.
A breakdown of all those core art principles, balance, emphasis, all that.
Right.
And even a deep dive into the psychology behind how our brains react to art.
It's a real mix, a real smorgasbord.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
So what we want to do, right, is take you through all these different perspectives.
Yeah.
See how they connect. Spark some of those aha moments for you.
Right.
Make this whole world of aesthetics a little bit more understandable and a lot more engaging, for your busy life, right?
Right, that's right.
We don't want to bog you down.
No.
So
let's get started. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So I think a good place to start is with those basic building blocks of visual appeal.
Okay.
Right, the foundations. And actually several of the things you sent me really get into this. I'm thinking of Howard Schneider's video. He jumps right into proportion.
Right.
Which he basically defines as like the amounts of different elements you have in a piece.
Okay.
The quantity of one color compared to another.
Right.
Size of shapes.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And from that idea of proportion, he goes on to talk about two really crucial categories: contrast and balance.
Classic building block. It's like the fundamentals you learn in any art class.
Exactly. So contrast, as Schneider points out, is all about difference. Big versus small, horizontal versus vertical, bright versus dull. He even mentions Johannes Itten.
Oh, yeah.
And his famous color contrast from the Bauhaus.
Right. And it's not just the obvious stuff like black and white, although that's a very strong example, very stark.
Yeah. And the Art Ed Guru video emphasizes that later on too. But Schneider's examples, they're really interesting. Like there's this information design piece at MoMA with just black letters on a white background.
Okay.
But he points out how the different text sizes create this sense of contrast
Interesting.
that makes it more visually appealing. And it really shows how even very functional design uses contrast effectively.
Right. It's not just about aesthetics for aesthetics' sake. It's about communication, too.
Exactly. Exactly. And what I thought was really fascinating was how he brought in Andre Cortez's photography
Oh, yeah, Cortez. I love his work.
to illustrate these even more subtle kinds of contrasts,
Oh, interesting. What kind of contrast is he talking about with Cortez?
like plain versus volume, hard versus soft, precise versus hazy.
Oh, wow, those are subtle.
Yeah.
But I can see how those would really add a lot to an image. It just makes you realize how many layers of difference can come together to make something visually captivating.
Yeah, it's not just one thing. It's like all these different elements playing off each other, right?
Exactly. And this is something that Tim Packer echoes in his fine arts video. He just defines contrast very simply as difference.
Okay.
And he shows how important it is for drawing our attention, creating drama in a painting. He has this example with a bright orange circle against this background of blues and greens.
Okay.
And you can't help but look at that orange circle. It just pops right out at you.
Oh, I see.
And it shows you just how powerful contrast can be to just grab your eye.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not always about being subtle.
Right.
Sometimes it's about
Sometimes it's about being bold.
being bold. Yeah. And Art Ed Guru's review of art principles, it gives all these really relatable visuals too.
Oh, cool.
There's black and white photos.
Yeah.
Then there's these desert landscapes that show near versus far. There's cityscapes with tall buildings versus shorter buildings.
Yeah.
And it really drives home the point that contrast is everywhere. Like we see it all the time, even if we're not consciously thinking about it.
Absolutely. It's in the natural world. It's in the built environment. It's fundamental to how we perceive the world.
Totally. But contrast on its own isn't the whole story, right?
Right.
Schneider then goes on to talk about balance,
Okay.
which he describes as like the distribution of visual weight or forces almost
Okay.
to create this sense of harmony.
Okay. That makes sense.
Right. So it's not just about having difference, it's about how those differences are arranged.
Right. It's like a seesaw.
Yeah.
You got to have enough weight on both sides.
Exactly. And he outlines 4 main types of balance.
Oh, okay.
So there's symmetrical balance,
Yeah.
where one side basically mirrors the other,
Okay.
like in that Jasper Johns artwork he showed.
Classic example. Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's asymmetrical balance, which is more uneven.
Okay.
It's a more uneven distribution, but it still feels balanced
Okay.
overall. And he used Mondrian's compositions as a good example of that.
Mondrian. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, and then there's approximate symmetry, which is really interesting
Okay.
because things are similar on both sides, but not exactly the same, and that creates a sense of counterweight.
Okay.
Like a subtle kind of balance.
Right.
And he used that Ralph Lauren window display as an example. Remember?
Oh, yeah. The one with
the draped fabric on one side.
yes, and the figure on the other.
Yeah, exactly. So even though they weren't mirror images,
Yeah.
it still felt balanced because that overall visual weight was evenly distributed.
That's really clever, the way they did that.
Yeah. And then the last type is radial symmetry,
Okay. Yeah.
where everything radiates out from a central point. And he used Paula Scher's posters as an example for that.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And what I found really interesting was that he also talked about balance in terms of the amounts of things, like with color.
Right.
Like using less of one color to really draw attention to another.
Oh, interesting. Like making it a focal point.
Exactly. And Tim Packer, he also emphasizes balance, but he talks about it alongside these other 2 concepts, harmony and unity.
Right.
So harmony, he says, is about things looking similar,
Okay.
right? And unity is about everything belonging together. But he says you need enough contrast to make it interesting, right?
You need that spice. You need that little bit of something different.
Yeah, you don't want it to be boring.
Right. Otherwise, it just all blends together.
Exactly. And he showed how even just one contrasting color can feel out of place.
Oh.
Unless it's kind of echoed elsewhere in the composition. So it's about
finding that balance, right?
It's about finding that balance, yeah. And then Art Ed Guru, they also cover balance in their video.
Okay.
They talk about symmetrical, asymmetrical, all over pattern,
Right.
and central placement.
Right.
And they give all these clear examples, you know.
It's good to have those visuals.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And they even use Van Gogh's Starry Night
Oh, wow.
to illustrate asymmetrical balance.
How does that work? I've never thought about it like that.
Well, they point out how that large, dark tree on the left is balanced by the brighter areas of the mountains and the town on the right.
Oh, that's actually really insightful. I never would have thought of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not symmetrical, right?
Oh,
But it still has this sense of equilibrium,
right.
which I guess is the whole point of balance.
Exactly, exactly. So from these sources, it seems like we're getting a pretty good grasp of the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Visual appeal, it's built on those carefully considered proportions, using contrast to create interest, to draw the eye,
Right.
but also balance to give it a sense of harmony and stability. And these aren't just like abstract ideas, they're actual practical tools that
Yeah.
are used across all forms of visual art and design.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about those as tools, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about like randomly putting things together.
Right.
There's intentionality behind it.
There is. There's thought and craftsmanship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think now's a good time to kind of zoom out a little bit
Okay.
from those building blocks and look at this larger concept of aesthetics itself.
Right. Beyond just those basic principles.
Right. Right. And Dan Rager's paper, Aesthetics and Culture. This is a really helpful one here.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Because it starts by connecting aesthetics to visual art, the things
Uh-huh.
we've just been talking about.
Okay.
But then, and this is really important, it goes beyond that.
Okay.
It extends it to music, to non-art objects, and even to our everyday experiences.
So it's not just about like going to a museum or a concert hall.
Right, exactly.
It's about how we experience beauty in all aspects of our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what I thought was really fascinating was that he identified properties like unity, balance, movement, dominance, not just in art, but as these overarching aesthetic qualities
Oh, okay.
that we perceive in so many things. Like they're not limited to art.
Right. So those principles we can find them operating in nature.
Yeah.
We can find them in the way we arrange our homes.
Yeah, in fashion.
In fashion,
You know,
exactly.
yeah. It's everywhere.
Everywhere. And it's interesting because he also talks about the purpose of art. And he lists like all these different purposes.
Oh, right.
Like aesthetic enjoyment, obviously.
Right.
But then also to amuse, to reflect culture, to decorate, to have economic value.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole list, and it just makes you realize that there are so many reasons why we create and interact with art.
Yeah. And I love how he delves into the aesthetics of music.
Oh yeah, the music part is really cool.
He talks about melody, harmony, rhythm, form, style,
Right.
and how they all work together
Right.
to create this aesthetic beauty.
Yeah.
Even if you don't know anything about music theory, you can still appreciate those things.
Absolutely. And then there's this part about the aesthetics of non-art objects.
Oh, yeah.
Like how we judge their appeal by comparing them to art, essentially.
Right. And he uses examples like figure skating and gymnastics.
Right, where you're judged on your grace and form.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even how food is presented on a plate.
Yeah. It's like we're always looking for those artistic qualities.
Right. Well, we're constantly making these comparisons.
Even in everyday things.
Yeah.
But he does make this point though that it can be a problem
Oh, guys.
to only compare non-art to art.
Right.
Because it can make us undervalue those non-art forms.
Right. So it's like saying that something's only beautiful if it looks like a painting or a sculpture.
Exactly. And he argues for appreciating the unique aesthetic qualities of different kinds of objects and experiences.
I like that. It's like appreciating the beauty of a well-designed car.
Yeah.
Or a beautiful piece of architecture, even if it's not technically art.
Yeah. And this ties in really nicely with his discussion of Japanese aesthetics.
Oh yeah, the Japanese aesthetics.
Which he highlights as this non-Western tradition
Right.
that finds aesthetic value in everyday objects and activities.
Right. It's not just about the object itself. Right. It's about the whole experience, the whole context.
Right. And he talks about how they value the inherent qualities of things
Yeah.
and respecting human needs.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's a very different way of thinking about aesthetics.
It is. It is. And he gives the example of the Japanese tea ceremony, which is just, I mean, it's an entire aesthetic experience,
Oh yeah.
right? It's about the setting.
The utensils.
Yeah, the specific utensil.
Quiet conversation, the way the weather might be that day.
Yeah, yeah. And this concept of ichigo ichi,
Right.
which means one chance, one meeting, right?
Right.
Really emphasizes that each moment
It's unique.
is fleeting and unique.
Yeah.
And it's quite different from this Western focus on the art object as this permanent, separate
Yeah,
thing.
like an isolated object.
Exactly. And Rager even points out how this idea of disinterestedness really came about in the 18th century.
Right, right. And that leads us perfectly to Immanuel Kant and his ideas about aesthetic taste. I mean, Kant is really foundational in Western aesthetics.
Yeah.
And he makes this really important distinction between what he calls the pleasant,
Okay.
the beautiful, and the good.
Okay, let's break that down.
Yeah. So the pleasant for Kant is what gratifies our senses, right?
Yeah.
It's tied to our personal desires, our needs.
Right.
You know, so it's very much connected to our individual experience.
Subjective.
It's subjective, exactly. Then you have the good, which is what we value, you know, for its objective worth, its usefulness.
Okay.
So this is about, you know, what's morally good,
Right.
what's useful for society, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But then you have the beautiful, which is a bit different.
Okay.
The beautiful, according to Kant, it simply pleases us.
Yeah.
And the key here is that our enjoyment of it is disinterested.
Okay. Disinterested. That's a key word for Kant.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So what does he mean by that?
He means that when we judge something as beautiful, we're not doing it because it satisfies a personal need or it serves a particular purpose. We're appreciating it purely for its form, you know, for how it appears to us.
Okay. Okay.
And this disinterested satisfaction, Kant argues, leads us to believe that everyone else should also find it beautiful.
Okay. So even though
it's subjective.
it's objective,
There's this feeling that it should be universal.
he calls it a universal subjective validity.
Yeah.
So it's subjective, right?
Right.
Because it's our own judgment.
Right.
But we feel like it should be universal. We feel like everyone should agree with us.
I see. So is it like when we see something beautiful,
Yeah.
we almost have this feeling like everyone else should see it the same way.
Exactly. It's like we're tapping into something that's bigger than just our own individual experience.
Right. We're experiencing something that we think is universally true.
I see.
In a way.
Okay. So how does that work in our minds then?
Well, Kant talks about this feeling of harmony between our imagination and our understanding. You know, these are two key parts of how we process the world, according to Kant. And when we perceive something as beautiful, it's like these two faculties are working together in perfect harmony, and that leads us to think that this experience is something we can share, that others should have it as well.
I see. And so that's where this idea of the universal voice comes from.
Exactly. He talks about this universal voice. It's not a logical rule-based universality, right?
Right.
It's a subjective one. It's based on this feeling.
Right.
This shared feeling of harmony within ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get it.
It's tricky stuff. It's Kant.
It is. So moving on from defining aesthetics, I mean, I thought it was really interesting how the Crash Course Philosophy video
Yes.
just jumps right in to this question. What is art for?
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of it all?
It's a big question.
It is. And they start by looking at Plato, who surprisingly was actually very critical of art.
Oh yeah, Plato. He wasn't a big fan.
No, not really. He was worried that art appealed to our emotions rather than our reason.
Right.
And he thought reason should always be in control.
Yeah, Plato was all about reason.
Yeah. So he saw art as potentially dangerous, really.
Right. It's like it could lead us astray, you know, from the path of truth and reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he also didn't like how art depicted things that weren't real as if they were real.
Right.
and that kind of went against his whole pursuit of ultimate truth.
Right, right. It's like creating these false idols.
Yeah, yeah. And it's really interesting because he actually argued for censoring certain kinds of art.
Yeah, that's pretty extreme.
It is, it is. But then the video jumps ahead
Okay.
to this 20th century philosopher, R.G. Collingwood, who made this distinction between what he called amusement art, which is like,
Oh, fun stuff.
the fun stuff.
The stuff that helps us escape.
Yeah, yeah. And then magic art,
Okay.
which he believed actually changes how we interact with the world.
Okay, so the art that has a real impact.
Yeah, yeah. And he used Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as an example.
Oh, interesting. A powerful book.
Yeah,
For sure.
of magic art.
Right.
Because it really had an impact on how people viewed slavery.
Yeah, it definitely changed public opinion.
Yeah, and Collingwood, he felt that we should prioritize magic art.
Yeah.
The stuff that makes us better people, that helps us live better lives.
Right, right.
But as the Crash Course guys point out, the line between the two can be blurry.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right? Something that's pure escapism for one person could be really life-changing for another.
Right. It's all about how it resonates with you, with your own experiences.
Yeah, exactly. And they use the Harry Potter series as an example.
Oh, yeah, Harry Potter's good example.
Because it's,
It's entertaining.
it's entertaining, but it's also
But it also deals with some pretty deep themes.
yeah, like good versus evil and love and loss and all that.
Right. And it can be really, really impactful for people, especially young people.
Yeah, yeah. So it makes you think about how art functions in our lives in all these different ways.
It does. It does. And it's not always so clear cut.
Right.
It's not always so easy to categorize.
Right. And speaking of impact, I mean, I thought they got into some really tricky territory.
Yeah.
With that discussion of morality.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Morality and art, always a thorny issue.
Yeah. It is. And they use that example of Marco Everesti's goldfish blenders.
Yeah, the goldfish blends.
Which is just, I mean, it's meant to provoke a reaction.
It definitely does.
Right. It forces you to really think about whether something that might be seen as morally wrong
Right.
can still be considered art.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really tough question. And it brings up that long-standing debate between the autonomists who say that art and morality are completely separate,
Right.
and the aesthetic moralists who believe that any moral flaw in a work of art actually makes it less valuable as art.
Right. So it's like, does the intention of the artist or the outcome of the artwork,
Right.
does that affect how we judge it?
Exactly. Regardless of how well it's made or what ideas it's exploring.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question that philosophers and artists have been debating for centuries.
Yeah. And there's no easy answer.
No.
Mm-hmm.
And the video also touches on how art can challenge our existing beliefs and values.
Right.
Which I think most of us would agree is a good thing.
Yeah, it's good to be challenged.
But it also raises this question of whether artists can be held responsible if their work inspires negative actions or attitudes.
Right. So it's like where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
It is. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. So all these questions about art's purpose and its impact, I mean, I think it leads us to consider all these different ways of looking at art,
Right, like theoretical frameworks, different lenses.
Exactly. And Aline Farrar's video, she does such a good job of explaining this.
Oh, yeah.
She goes through several key movements in art theory.
Oh, cool.
Starting with formalism.
Okay.
And what's called new criticism.
Okay.
Which really emphasize looking at the artwork itself.
Okay.
So the form, the techniques used, the text in isolation, without thinking about the historical context or the artist's biography.
Right. So it's all about the work itself.
Exactly. It's the whole art for art's sake idea.
Right.
And the new critics, they had this famous saying, there's nothing outside the text.
Right. So you're not supposed to bring in any outside information when you're analyzing a work of art.
Exactly. And then we move into structuralism.
Okay.
Which she describes as kind of an extension of formalism.
Okay.
So instead of seeing art as this message,
right.
Structuralists see it more like a system or like a grammar.
Okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, and this is where Ferdinand de Saussure's ideas about semiotics come in.
Semiotics, yeah.
The whole idea of the sign,
Right.
which is made up.